The airport lounge was flooded with harsh sunlight pouring through the glass ceiling. Ethan stood near the window in a worn co-pilot uniform, holding the hand of his 7-year-old daughter. A sharply dressed female CEO walked in with her assistant and glanced at him. She smirked. "A co-pilot," she said lightly. "So, not the real pilot." Her assistant laughed. A few passengers turned to watch, amused. Ethan's daughter squeezed his hand and whispered, "Dad, why is she laughing?" Ethan didn't respond. He knelt slightly and smiled at her instead. The CEO added louder this time, "Some people assist, others lead." The air grew heavy. Ethan stayed silent. Then a deep thundering sound shook the glass walls. Outside, a sleek black helicopter descended toward the private runway, and everything stopped. She mocked the single dad co-pilot. Ethan Cross was 41 years old, and he had learned that waiting was part of flying. Schedules shifted, weather changed, decisions were delayed by people who never set foot in a cockpit. So when the charter he was supposed to assist was postponed, Ethan didn't complain. He took his place in the regional airport lounge and waited. Beside him stood his daughter, Ava. Ava was 7, quiet, observant, the kind of child who noticed tone before words and silence before noise. She held her father's hand lightly, not because she was afraid, but because it felt normal to stay close. Ethan wore a co-pilot uniform that had clearly lived a long life. The fabric was clean but faded at the seams. The wings on his chest were simple, no shine, no gold trim, no attempt to impress anyone. That was intentional. To most people passing through the lounge, Ethan looked like what he allowed himself to look like, a contract co-pilot waiting for instructions. Useful but replaceable, skilled but secondary. He was fine with that. Ava tugged gently at his sleeve and pointed to his wrist. "Dad," she asked softly, "why don't you wear the fancy watch like the other pilots?" Ethan glanced down at the watch strapped to his wrist. It was plain, dark, scratched, built for function, not attention. "Because quiet things work better," he said. Ava nodded as if that made perfect sense. They sat down together, Ethan choosing a seat where Ava could see the runway through the glass wall. He liked her watching aircraft. It taught patience, respect for machines that didn't forgive arrogance. Around them, the lounge filled with movement. Executives spoke loudly into phones. Assistants hurried with tablets pressed to their chests. Travelers compared destinations and schedules like trophies. Ethan listened without listening. His phone buzzed once. A short message from operations. "Stand by, possible call." He didn't reply. He never needed to. Ava leaned her head against his arm. "Are we flying soon?" she asked. "Maybe," Ethan replied. "Or maybe we're just waiting today." She smiled. "Waiting is okay." Ethan smiled back. He had raised her that way. To understand that stillness wasn't weakness. That not every moment needed to be filled with noise. What Ava didn't know was that waiting used to mean something very different to her father. Years earlier, waiting had happened in hangars at dawn, engines cold and untested. It had happened in briefing rooms where silence carried weight. It had happened before flights no one talked about afterward. But those years were behind him now. At least, that was what Ethan believed. He glanced around the lounge, noting exits, reflections in the glass, the way sound traveled. Old habits didn't disappear. They simply softened. That was when the atmosphere shifted. The doors to the lounge opened again, and conversation levels subtly rose. People noticed. They always did when confidence entered a room ahead of its owner. A woman stepped inside, heels sharp against the floor, posture perfect. Her tailored suit caught the light. An assistant followed closely, already mid-sentence, already trying to keep up. The woman scanned the room like it belonged to her. Her eyes landed on Ethan, on the worn uniform, on the simple wings, on the child beside him. A smile touched her lips. Not kind, not curious, amused. Ethan felt Ava's hand tighten slightly in his. "Dad," Ava whispered, "is she important?" Ethan looked down at her. "Everyone's important," he said evenly. The woman's voice carried across the lounge moments later, casual and cutting. "A co-pilot?" she said. So, not the real pilot. Ethan didn't look up. He focused on Ava, crouching slightly so they were eye level. Hey, he said gently, remember what we talked about? Ava nodded. We don't answer mean questions. That's right, Ethan said. We stay kind. The woman continued speaking behind them, unaware or unconcerned that a child was listening. Some people assist, she added. Others lead. The words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. Ethan stayed silent, not because he couldn't respond, but because the lesson his daughter was learning mattered more than correcting a stranger's assumption, and because he knew something no one else in that lounge did. Waiting was almost over. She mocked the single dad copi. The woman didn't stop after the first remark. She never did. Mockery, when it went unchallenged, had a way of growing bolder. Her assistant leaned closer, laughing politely at the right moments, eyes flicking toward Ethan as if he were part of the lounge's entertainment. I'd never let a co-pilot fly my aircraft, the woman said, loud enough for nearby seats to hear. You want leadership in the left seat, not someone who just assists. A few people smiled, not because they agreed, but because it felt safer to smile than to object. Ava shifted beside Ethan. Her shoulders drew inward, the way children do when they sense danger but don't fully understand it. She looked down at her shoes, then up at her father. Dad, she whispered, did you do something wrong? Ethan felt the question land in his chest. No, he said quietly, not at all. The woman turned then, finally noticing Ava properly. She tilted her head, studying the child with open curiosity. So this is your daughter, she said. That must be interesting. Ethan straightened slightly. Please don't speak to my child. The woman raised an eyebrow, amused rather than offended. I'm just saying, she replied. Kids should see ambition, not limitations. Ava's fingers tightened around Ethan's sleeve. Ethan placed a calm hand on her shoulder, grounding her. His voice stayed even. My daughter sees kindness, he said. That's enough. The woman laughed softly as if he'd told a joke. Around them, the lounge grew quiet in that particular way that meant people were listening without wanting to be seen listening. The air felt thinner, stretched by discomfort. Ethan could feel Ava shrinking into herself. He knelt down again, lowering his voice so only she could hear. Look at me, he said. Ava did. You're safe, he said, and you didn't do anything wrong. She nodded, trusting him completely. Behind them, the woman continued. Honestly, she said to her assistant, I don't understand why they even give co-pilots uniforms that look like this. It confuses people. Ethan didn't turn around. He had learned long ago that defending ego was loud and teaching character was quiet. His phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen. Clear runway B, priority landing in 10. He didn't react. Not yet. Ava noticed the screen light up. Is that work? She asked. Maybe, Ethan said. Just stay close to me. Across the lounge, a technician seated near the window frowned at a display monitor mounted on the wall. He leaned forward, squinting. The monitor updated. Flight designation, Cross E. Call sign Raven01. The technician's brow furrowed. That's strange, he murmured to himself. Another staff member leaned over. What is? That call sign, the technician said. That's not a co-pilot designation. The woman's laughter continued, unaware. I mean, she said, some people are just born to support others. Ethan exhaled slowly, not out of anger, out of patience. Ava looked up at him again. Dad, she asked softly, why don't you tell her who you really are? Ethan smiled faintly. Because, he said, who I am isn't something I need to announce. The lounge doors suddenly slid open. A gust of air swept through, carrying with it a deep mechanical rumble that didn't belong to the terminal. Heads turned instinctively. The glass walls trembled slightly. Outside, beyond the runway, a sleek black helicopter descended toward the private landing zone. Its rotors cut the air with controlled power, precise and unmistakable. The lounge fell silent. The woman stopped mid-sentence. What is that? She asked, irritation flashing across her face. Why are they landing there? An airport security officer hurried inside, headset pressed to his ear. He scanned the room quickly, then locked eyes with Ethan. The officer straightened. "Sir," he said clearly, walking toward him, "your aircraft is ready." The woman froze. Her assistant dropped his phone. It clattered loudly against the floor. Ava's eyes widened. "Dad," she whispered, awe creeping into her voice. "Is that for you?" Ethan finally stood. He took Ava's hand firmly, gently. "Yes," he said, "it is." The officer waited respectfully, posture rigid, like someone standing before rank. The woman's face drained of color. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Ethan didn't look at her. He focused on Ava. "Remember what we talked about?" he asked. Ava nodded slowly. "Staying kind." "That's right," Ethan said. He turned then, finally meeting the woman's eyes. There was no triumph in his expression. No satisfaction. Only calm. Somewhere behind them, a technician whispered to a colleague, voice low but clear enough to carry. "That's not a co-pilot," he said. "That's Captain Cross." The words rippled through the room. The woman swallowed hard. "Captain?" she repeated. Ethan didn't correct her. He didn't need to, because the truth was already landing, louder than any response he could give. And for the first time since she entered the lounge, the woman understood what real power looked like. It didn't shout. It didn't mock. It waited. "Have you ever stayed calm while being disrespected?" "Comment I have." She mocked the single dad kopikai. The room didn't recover immediately. Silence settled into the lounge like pressure, thick and uncomfortable. People who had been smiling seconds earlier now avoided eye contact. Phones were lowered. Conversations died mid-sentence. The woman who had been mocking Ethan stood completely still. "Captain?" she said again. Quieter this time, as if repeating the word might change its meaning. Ethan didn't answer her. He focused on Ava, squeezing her hand gently. "You ready?" he asked. Ava nodded, eyes still wide. "Always." The security officer waited patiently, hands folded behind his back. He didn't rush. He didn't speak again. He didn't need to. The helicopter outside idled steadily, rotors slicing the air with calm authority. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't loud for attention. It was simply there, waiting. The woman finally found her voice. "I don't understand," she said, turning slightly, as if looking for support from her assistant. "He said he was a co-pilot." Ethan turned then, just enough to face her. His expression was neutral, not defensive, not smug. "I said that was my uniform," he replied, "not my ceiling." The words landed harder than any insult she had thrown earlier. Her assistant swallowed. "That helicopter, it's yours?" "Yes," Ethan said simply. A murmur rippled through the lounge. The woman took a half step back. You're a private operator?" Ethan shook his head once. "Owner and lead pilot." The air seemed to thin. One of the lounge staff, a young man who had been quietly watching the monitor, spoke without meaning to. "Raven 01, he said. "That call sign is used for high-risk test flights." Ethan glanced at him and gave a small nod. "I train crews," Ethan said, "and I test aircraft before other people trust their lives to them." The woman's face flushed. "Then why didn't you say anything?" The question hung there, sharp and exposed. Ava looked up at her father, curious now rather than confused. Ethan looked down at his daughter first, then back at the woman. "Because my daughter was standing right there," he said calmly, "and she doesn't need to watch me defend my ego." The room went completely silent. That sentence did something no helicopter ever could. It stripped the moment bare. The woman's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time since she walked in, she didn't look powerful. She looked small. "I didn't mean," she began. Ethan raised a hand gently, not to silence her, but to pause the moment. "It's done," he said. "Let it be done." The officer cleared his throat softly. "Captain Cross, we're behind schedule." Ethan nodded. He crouched slightly to Ava's level. "Hey," he said, voice warm. "Did any of that scare you?" Ava shook her head. "No, I was just wondering why she was so mean." Ethan smiled faintly. "Some people forget how to listen." Ava considered that. She didn't forget. She just didn't try. Ethan's smile deepened, just a little. The woman heard that too. She stepped forward, carefully now, her tone stripped of arrogance. I owe you an apology, she said, to both of you. Ethan didn't interrupt. He didn't encourage her either. You mocked him, Ava said quietly, not accusing, just stating a fact. The woman's eyes flicked to Ava, then back to Ethan. I did, she admitted, and I was wrong. Ethan nodded once. Thank you for saying that. It wasn't forgiveness, it was acknowledgement. The woman exhaled, shoulders dropping. I thought leadership meant being above others, she said. I didn't realize how loud that sounds when it's empty. Ethan didn't respond. He turned toward the glass wall where the helicopter waited. As they walked, people stepped aside instinctively, not because of status, but because something in his presence had shifted. Respect had replaced curiosity. Awareness had replaced mockery. The woman watched them go, her reflection faint in the glass. Captain Cross, she called out. Ethan stopped but didn't turn fully. Yes? She hesitated, then asked the question that mattered. Why do you dress like that? She asked. Why let people think you're less than you are? Ethan looked back at her, Ava still holding his hand. Because humility keeps my world simple, he said, and simplicity keeps my daughter safe. He turned away again. Outside, the noise of the rotors grew louder as the door to the runway access opened. Sunlight hit them full and bright. Ava squeezed his hand. Dad? Yes? Are you mad at her? Ethan thought for a moment. No. Why not? Because anger teaches nothing, he said, but example does. They approached the helicopter. A ground crew member saluted instinctively, then caught himself, embarrassed. Ethan returned the gesture casually. As Ava climbed into her seat, she looked back once more toward the lounge. Dad, she said, do you think she learned something? Ethan secured her harness, then leaned back. I think, he said carefully, she learned that real leadership doesn't need to announce itself. The door closed. The helicopter lifted smoothly from the ground, rising above the terminal, above the glass ceiling, above the waiting room where judgment had turned into silence. Inside the lounge, no one spoke for a long time, because everyone there had just witnessed something they didn't expect. Not power, not wealth, but dignity that refused to shout. And the woman who had mocked a co-pilot stood very still, understanding far too late that she hadn't been watching a man wait. She had been watching a leader choose restraint. She mocked the single dad co-pilot. The helicopter didn't climb fast. It rose smoothly, as if it had nothing to prove. Ava pressed her face close to the window, watching the terminal shrink below them. The runway lines became thin white threads. The lounge with its glass ceiling turned into a bright rectangle of light and shadow. Ethan sat beside her, calm and steady, headset resting lightly over one ear. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. Ava finally broke the silence. Dad, she asked softly, why did you stay quiet? Ethan looked at her, then at the sky ahead. Because, he said, people are allowed to be wrong, but we decide what we become in response. Ava thought about that. So, you didn't want to fight? Ethan shook his head. Not in front of you. Ava leaned back in her seat. Was she trying to hurt you? She asked. Ethan paused, careful. She was trying to feel taller, he said. Some people do that when they're scared inside. Ava's eyebrows pulled together. She didn't look scared. Ethan smiled faintly. That's the point. The helicopter continued forward, slicing through clear air. Below them, the airport looked orderly and small. Up here, status didn't matter. Only skill and calm mattered. Ethan checked the route, then glanced down at Ava again. You did really well back there, he said. Ava blinked. I didn't do anything. You stayed kind, Ethan replied. That's not nothing. Ava nodded slowly, absorbing it. Back at the lounge, the atmosphere had changed like a tide. The moment Ethan and Ava left, noise returned, but it returned differently. People spoke in lower voices. The laughter was gone. The smirks had vanished. In their place was awkward reflection. The female CEO still stood near the entrance, unmoving, as if her body had forgotten how to perform confidence. Her assistant had picked up the phone, but he kept staring at the floor, embarrassed to meet anyone's eyes. A middle-aged man who had watched earlier cleared his throat. That was, Impressive, he murmured. Another woman replied quietly, no, it was humiliating for us. The CEO heard them. She didn't snap back. She didn't defend herself. For once, she didn't try to control the room with a sharper tone. Instead, she walked toward the security officer who had addressed Ethan. Who is he? She asked, voice low. The officer didn't look proud to answer. He looked careful, like the information carried weight. Captain Ethan Cross, he said, owner and lead pilot, flight test and training. He's brought aircraft down safely that most people wouldn't even dare to touch. The CEO swallowed. And she began, struggling. He just stood there and let me talk. The officer nodded once. Yes, ma'am. Her assistant whispered, why would someone like that wear a co-pilot uniform? The officer's answer was simple. Because he doesn't need you to know. The CEO's eyes tightened. She turned away, as if the glass wall might show her the helicopter again. But it was already gone. Hours later, a formal email reached the leadership group. It wasn't a public statement. It wasn't a trending apology. It was a private correction. The CEO sent it herself. She addressed Ethan by full name. She apologized for the disrespect she had shown in the lounge. She stated clearly that no role deserved mockery, and that professionalism began with how people spoke when they thought no one important was listening. Then she added one final line. Respect is not earned by rank alone. It is revealed by character. People read it twice. Some felt ashamed. Some felt relieved. Some realized they had smiled along earlier because they were afraid of being singled out. And now they understood the cost of that fear. On the helicopter, Ethan didn't know about the email. He didn't care. He cared about the small voice beside him, the warm weight of a child who trusted him completely. Ava rested her head lightly against his shoulder. Dad, she whispered. Were you sad when she laughed? Ethan's eyes stayed on the horizon. No, he said. Ava lifted her head, surprised. Really? Ethan nodded once. I was proud. Proud? She asked. Yes, Ethan said, because you saw what disrespect looks like, and you saw how to stay kind anyway. Ava looked out the window again, thinking hard. So the real win, she said slowly, was not the helicopter. Ethan smiled, deeper this time. That's right, he said. The real win was you learning who you want to be. Ava nodded, quiet and satisfied. And in that moment, Ethan knew something with complete certainty. Even if the world never respected him, his daughter would. And that was more than enough. The helicopter touched down smoothly on a private pad outside the city, far from crowds and glass walls. The engines powered down, leaving only the sound of wind brushing across open space. Ava unbuckled her seat slowly, still thoughtful. Dad, she said, do you think people will remember what happened? Ethan considered the question as he stepped out and lifted her gently to the ground. Some will, he said. Most won't. Ava frowned. Is that bad? Ethan shook his head. No, lessons don't always stay with everyone. They only need to stay with the right people. They walked toward the small hangar where a mechanic waited respectfully. No cameras, no audience, just routine. That evening, Ethan drove Ava home himself. They stopped for dinner at a quiet place near the water. Nothing expensive, nothing impressive. Ava ate happily, telling him about a drawing she wanted to make for school. Later, as Ethan tucked her into bed, Ava asked one last question. Dad, if you were really important, why didn't you act like it? Ethan paused, then sat beside her. Because, he said gently, real importance doesn't need to prove itself. It shows up when it's needed, then steps back. Ava smiled sleepily. I like that. She fell asleep within minutes. The next day, Ethan returned to work like any other. Same uniform, same calm posture. The difference was subtle but real. People who had heard about the incident spoke differently around him now, softer, more careful. Some nodded with respect. Others avoided his eyes. Ethan didn't correct them. He hadn't earned anything new. They had simply seen him clearly for the first time. And that was enough. Never confuse silence with weakness. Some of the strongest people in the room are the ones who speak last, not first. They don't announce who they are. They don't defend themselves when mocked. They wait, not out of fear, not out of fear, but out of control. True confidence doesn't humiliate others. True leadership doesn't need an audience. And true strength is often quiet enough to be mistaken for nothing at all. Children learn more from how we respond to disrespect than from any success we display. Because when pride stays calm and dignity stays kind, the lesson lasts longer than the moment. If you believe real strength doesn't shout, and the best lessons are taught through example, subscribe to this channel. Here we share stories about dignity, restraint, and parents who choose character over applause.